Hello, welcome to In the Light, Growing Your Soul with me, Anna Isabel. And I'm delighted because I have with me someone who, well, I guess we've been waiting a long time for this opportunity to speak, and it is Sally Crow. Hello, Sally Crow.
Hi, thank you. And yes, it is a bit of a wait, but I think it'll be worth it.
I think so too, because the book that we are discussing is called Spirit Speaker. And it is a wonderful book about all things to do with, um, well, I guess, death, spirit, life going on, mediumship. It's that kind of book, and it is a very good one at that. So tell us about your journey to get to this point where you're writing a book on this subject.
Okay, so I actually wrote a whole book about that. My first book, Jump Girl, The Initiation and Art of a Spirit Speaker, was a memoir. And I grew up in a psychic family. My great grandmother was my first teacher. And she was also, although she had to do it a lot differently than me, selling worms and people coming to her house because they liked her cooking, but really they were coming for her to look into their lives and to talk to their dead. And she knew that I was going to be a medium when my mom was pregnant with me because a spirit told her. And that meant that even as a young age, she was really preparing me for it by saying things to me like, spirits talk to you, Sally, it's okay. And making it so casual that it's like telling me I had brown hair and blue eyes, like just this is what happens for you. So throughout my life growing up, I was connected to psychic things. I had if there was going to be an experience with a spirit any place that I was at, it was going to happen to me. And I wasn't afraid of it because of the way I had been raised. I started reading cards for the public when I was 18, and by the time I was 30, I had a major opening that, could have had me going to an emergency room thinking I was crazy because I was so clearly hearing spirit speak to me. And it was a planned opening. I had a team of 5 spirits that worked with me, and I have a great partner who I've been in a relationship with for 34 years. So, he was able to give me strength and also recognize that I wasn't crazy, that what I was having was a really intense experience, but I wasn't crazy. And at the time, we were talking 20 years ago, there was like one person, I think John Edwards was like on television. That was about it. It wasn't like there was tons of mediums out and about. And one of the spirits was my youngest sister's best friend who had died of malaria in Costa Rica at like 23 years old. And he ended up being a major part of my opening for me because while I knew him, I didn't know him that well. So I could actually have things that he was saying to me about his life. I could go and ask my sister, like, did this actually happen? Did you have this conversation in a diner? And I mean, it was really obscure things that you couldn't be kind of giving a mediocre answer with. And that I refer to as the November incident, that whole opening. It was intense in a lot of other ways too. I started having major past life memories of a life in Egypt. I started doing vocal toning with my voice as part of my healing practice. But the spirit part was huge. And they told me, you're going to write books, you're going to be on television. Now, I live in one of the smallest states in the United States, in one of the most rural areas of one of the most rural states. So I was like, what? I just can't see how this is going to happen. And they actually told me that everything would have a connection to Vermont, which is the state I'm from. That even sounded even crazier. Now, it all did. I literally had Robert Simmons, who is a person who's big in the crystal world, and he's written some books on crystals. literally came to my house. And I did a spirit communication session for him. Then he had me go to this big, 300 people event that he was doing as a presenter, doing spirit communication. Then he introduced me to my publisher. And I actually had my first book contract before I had even written a book. I had blogged and I did spirit communication for the publisher, and he was on the phone with his office. So I want to just bring in how spirit was so right, because this publisher, even though his company was out of California at the time, had started his company in Vermont. Okay. And then not a year, maybe a couple of years later, there was some change in what he was doing, and he ended up going to Inner Traditions, and I went with him. And Inner Traditions their location is in Vermont. So Spirit was totally involved in everything, and even the most far-fetched things that they told me was going to be happening, have. And so I've been in that weird space of watching it.
So you referred to an opening, and I'm wondering whether that might be what some people call an initiation, where suddenly things begin to happen.
Mhm. Yeah. So I had worked with the public as a psychic reader. Divination was the first thing I was doing for the public. So I had already done that. I thought of myself as being pretty open. I did really accurate readings. I had a healing. I mean, I was doing this as work. And yeah, I think it is kind of an initiation, but it literally went on for me for months. I called it the November incident because that's when it started, like literally November 1st. Boom, here you go. But it was probably more like a 3-month process of, really having to look at everything. So while it's an initiation, it is. I think of when people talk about the word awakening, one of the things I like to remind people is that we don't all wake up happy or easy. Okay. And I've actually helped a few other people, probably like 5 or 6 other people, go through some major openings or initiations or awakenings. And one of the things that I've noticed is that, like, I'm not a person who ever hid anything from myself. That doesn't mean that I didn't have wounding. It doesn't mean that I didn't have, my own trauma I had to look through, but I was very analytical and able to see these things, even understand from a psychological perspective why they happened, People who I've been witness to who have hidden a lot from themselves, like, they compartmentalize everything, they've blocked things out. Those people, when they've gone through openings, have been, in my opinion, more challenging, because they also have to reveal all this stuff to themselves. And it's a really intense experience when you really open that door to mediumship. One of the things for me was realizing that I had somebody listening to me, which meant that the things that I said in my mind, we all have like that really crappy dialogue that we talk to ourselves with. All of a sudden, it was the awareness that someone else probably can hear me doing this. So it really changed a lot of how I interacted in my mind. I cleaned up a lot of my negative talk. I cleaned up a lot of, the little white lies that we tell ourselves, or the polite things, like that stuff all had to kind of change. I had to realize that all of a sudden, if somebody's listening to you, it feels weird. And I had to put in strange barriers. Like, I don't want you to talk to me when I'm in the bathroom, and I don't want you to talk to me if I'm having sex, and I don't want you to, stay out. We're private here. And I've done a lot of work with other people who are opening, and that's actually a lot of what my work is at this point in my life. Is I still do readings and I still do spirit communication regularly. See clients a couple days a week, both in person and mostly through Zoom, because they're all over the world at this point. But I also find that, I have more and more people. I started a mentorship program where I'm tutoring people. So where I used to teach, I got to a point where I really wanted to help people who were more serious seekers, because there's a lot of people who can teach a beginner class, and there's not a lot of people who have the ability to work with somebody when they're trying to move past that beginner's point into something that's more, because we're all individual. You can't really get that from being in a large group with other people. You have to have something, or it's easier anyways, to have a one-on-one connection.
Your book opens with something that your sister wrote, in fact, about your father's passing. And what comes through loud and clear is the importance of helping someone who is passing into, well, passing from this world into the next. Why do you feel that that's important?
I feel that death is like birth. We're both ends of a portal. In birth, we are usually the woman birthing, or birth. I would just want to say the person birthing, because what we call ourselves and how we identify has changed so much. But the person who's giving birth is surrounded usually by support, whether that support is nurses, midwives, doulas, family members. There's a holding space not only for the person giving birth, but the person coming into this world. And the same thing, is beneficial on the other end when we are crossing into spirit. We've lost a lot of our sacredness around death, especially since, I believe, since the 1950s and 60s, when we really wanted to homogenize what it looked like to be a modern culture. Okay, television was a big factor in that. All of a sudden, we had death as, I like to say 2 weeks of casseroles, a wake, and a funeral, and you're supposed to be okay. And part of why we're not okay is that nobody's taking part in the sacredness of death. If you've been present with somebody when they are dying, there is a healing that happens for the person who's witnessing it as well, especially if they're a little educated. Um, it's always helpful. There's a big movement in the United States for death doulas, which are trained people who sit and help families with that crossing. And I recently did a death that didn't think that I was going to be there the whole time. But when I got there and I was, getting near the time where I was like, okay, this is as much time as I think I can stay, I realized that the other people did not have any experience with the actual act of somebody crossing over. It was an expected death, it was a home death. And they were great caregivers. One of the people was even a nurse, but she was a nurse who worked in a hospital. And while she might have checked vitals and stuff for people when they were dying, that's a lot different. You're checking in, you're not sitting with the person, you're not listening, like in this case, to that death rattle that can be very unnerving. And having somebody with you who has experience makes it so that maybe the next time you're the person who can sit with somebody who has experience. Because once you've gone through it, it is like birth. I've been present in a lot of births, I've been present in a lot of deaths.
We, on this channel, I've interviewed the wonderful Felicity Warner several times, who's a soul midwife, she calls
Oh,
herself.
nice.
And it's through her work that I recognize yours. And also the one time in my life where this was required was 4 years ago, this June coming, when my father passed, and I could not be there.
Mm.
But I did have the ability to speak to him all through that time when he was passing,
Yeah.
because I couldn't hold his hand, because I couldn't be there, the only thing I could use was my voice. And I remember his carer saying to me, he definitely knows you're there because I can see his eyes moving when you're talking. So
Excuse me, were you talking to him like through a phone or were you
uh,
talking in your
I,
mind?
yes, it was as we are talking now. Uh,
Okay.
so it was quite, so I could see him. He couldn't really see me because he wasn't focused. His eyes were closed a lot of the time. But when I was speaking to him, apparently his eyes would move. So he was definitely aware. And subsequently, um, funnily enough, by accident, I had booked a reading with a medium for the day, it turns out, after he passed.
Mm,
And when that date came, I thought, well, I wonder, which was, the day after he'd passed. And he was there very clear, and it was very clear that he knew what I had been doing. And
mhm,
that was the experience I had with human, but two animals now. First, our one of our cats, and the second one, a magpie on a road just last week. And it was very clear he was dying, very clear he was afraid. I lifted him gently, put him somewhere safe, and gave him healing, and he relaxed. And within a few minutes after relaxing, his heart stopped. But it
mm.
was he was peaceful, and that was the thing. So why is this important? And for those who are witnessing, it's also really important because I'm at peace because I know what I did for my dad. And it hurt. Of course, it hurts. But I felt peaceful. And my mom, it meant a lot to her that I was. And in fact, none of his children could be with him because none of us live in the vicinity and none of us could go.
Mm.
So everybody was kind of floundering. And I said, well, look, we can all do this. So he was able to hear all of us. So everyone was able to see him, and we were able to speak to him. So he could hear all of us. So that was good. And just last week when that magpie died, had I not been there and been able to do what I did, the man who was originally trying to help him, I think would have been quite traumatized, and the other one after, because they felt there were two men desperately trying to help this magpie. And you could see they were really distressed.
Mhm.
But when I came in and I said, it's okay, he's dying, there's nothing we can do. And I just gently lifted him and put him aside, put my hands over him. And one of them said, does she know what she's doing? I,
Right.
I said, I'm praying. I didn't say I'm giving him healing because I wasn't sure whether they'd understand, but I said
Right.
praying. And one of them immediately, I could hear him praying behind me.
Mhm.
And when they saw him relax, they felt good. And when the bird passed, they were very grateful and very peaceful, if I can put it like that. So they had a very
Mhm.
important, it was a very profound experience for us all. But with
Yes.
two of them, they were not, the idea of the bird dying was extremely painful. But the fact that I was able to help him die peacefully softened it hugely for them.
Yes.
So that's the importance. So when I was reading that beginning that your sister wrote about your father, I was just struck by how beautiful his passing was.
He had a very beautiful passing. Um, so it's hard because most of us have been disassociated from death. Most of us, death happens in a hospital room. It's very sterile. A lot of times, family can't make it there because we live all over the world, or They can't handle it, which is another thing. And so when you talk about those people being distressed, I was 30, I was just barely 30, I think, right after I'd had my opening to spirit when I helped the first person die. And it was a woman who'd been a school teacher at my kid's school. I was on the school board. She was an amazing person. Our whole community kind of stepped up when she got cancer, and she was actually being taken care of in a community member's family house. The day that she was dying, I went there, and because I had gotten to the school dropping my kids off, and some of the other people were like, oh my God, she's having a really hard time. I had already been going to her house almost every day, or having my other Reiki students go and do Reiki on her because it was the only way she could really relax. So I drove down to the house. When I got there, another town member was there. And like you said, that woman was so distressed. She was, the only person who was sitting there. She was like probably 20 years older than me. So there's that part of you that would go, well, she should be able to handle this. But it was me at 30 who walked in and was like, okay. And like 15 minutes after I got there, her breathing changed and she started to have the death rattle. And if people don't know what that is, when people are dying, not always, but a lot of time, their breathing will become very, it's a real struggle, and you can hear like fluid in the lungs, and it's a hard thing to listen to. And I ended up doing CPR on her because she did not have a DNR, a do not resuscitate. She was a person who didn't expect that she was going to die from her cancer. And when you start CPR, you have to continue it until a medical professional shows up. But I felt her leave. So I was having to do this on somebody who'd already passed. And it wasn't, like bad or scary. It was kind of, weird that I knew the exact moment. And it was, and I don't think that you have to be psychic to know that. You just know it. And then, but the communication piece, she had actually that day, which was kind of funny, she'd been mostly out of it, but she kept telling she was supposed to be having this benefit concert because she taught Balkan chorus, and it wasn't for till 2 days later. But she kept telling that woman who was there that she needed to put all sorts of chairs in the living room because she was going to be getting a bunch of company. And within 15 minutes of her passing, people from all over the town and stuff just started coming in. With how they found out, I don't know. But as I was leaving the house, because once everybody else started showing up, I was like, I can go now. I've done what I need to do, and I don't necessarily want to be here anymore. I want to process this myself. And as I was walking through the house, she's like, I'm so sorry you had to do that, Sally. Her spirit already talking to me like, I'm sorry you had to keep doing CPR on me after I passed. And so it was this really beautiful thing. And as a medium, spirits will often talk about things that happened in the room, like what your dad had, where they were mostly comatose, and they still knew when people came to see them. They still knew when people were talking to them. They still knew that people were holding their hands. They knew all of that stuff, even though they were not, to the person who was visiting or who was sitting with them, might not be getting any physical connection that the person was still in their body. And they're really not. How I describe it is that they're beside their body at that point. People who die in accidents will often describe that they were standing on the side of the road by their body, watching the ambulance pull up, watching the situation. And I had an experience with a young woman who passed, who she had hit a bridge and then went into the bridge, over the bridge into the water. And when I met with her family, I was like, well, she died on impact. And they were able to confirm that because there was no water in her lungs. but it was like she jumped ship. Older souls will do that. If they know like the ship's going down, we're going, they will often step outside of the body and not have to sit in all that pain as their body is physically letting go.
I think one of the sad things about our culture is the fact, as you say, that we've become disconnected from the process of dying to the point where we are phobic about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's because we are taught now that there's nothing else. And so all that's left is this fear of nothing, or fear of the pain of the process, or of course, and that no matter what you believe is there, the fear of loss. um,
Right.
because even as mediums, people are, it's not the same, so there's a change.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this big fear, and I think it's so important that mediums are exist, because it's through them that we are able to understand that life goes on. And of course, you know, it's one of the beautiful things that in for me, training as a medium also is having that connection. Because when you
Mm-hmm.
have that connection with spirit, you're never alone. As you say, we would like to point out that we would like some privacy sometimes,
Right.
but at all other times we are very happy that we know that we're not alone. So in your mind, obviously you had this since you were a child and you grew up in a psychic family. Not everyone has their development so neatly or
Mm-hmm.
for them. What do you feel for somebody who's watching and would really love to, they kind of know that they've got something but they don't know what to do? What would you recommend?
The first thing I would recommend is to take doubt words out of your language. So words like maybe, kind of, and think so. Because often when people describe their experience, they will say something like, I think I saw my grandmother out of the corner of my eye. And I'm like, okay, can we say that without the word think in it? And if they say, I saw my grandmother out of the corner of my eye, I'm like, well, how does that feel? And they're like, I saw my grandmother. Because when we throw those doubt words in, first of all, we discredit ourselves. And it's really kind of silly because why would you suddenly, all of a sudden, I thought I saw my dead grandmother, but that was just my imagination. To me, that actually sounds more far fetched than you glimpsed your grandmother. Okay. Um, I think that everybody has the ability to communicate with their beloved dead, but that it's like art. You know, I think psychic abilities are best described. I actually refer to them as the psychic arts. And the reason why is because everybody can do art, but not everybody is going to be a artist. Okay. A lot of it is, yes, natural skill and ability helps, nurturing helps, dedication. I might have been raised in a family that had psychic abilities, but my grandmother died when I was 12. My sister's also psychic, one of them more than the other. And I, but I've been obsessed with this. So it's also like, how many hours have you put into something? You know, we often want to compare ourselves. Like, when my daughter is a really amazing artist, and growing up, my son, even though he's a pretty good artist, really wouldn't do art because he was always comparing himself to his sister who was exceptional. And people often do that. They're like, well, if I can't do this. And it's like, well, maybe you can't, but you still can have a experience. You can feel them, you can smell them, you might dream about them, and you can work to build that skill. The other thing I would tell people is that not all psychics experience input the same way. So some people will never see, some people will never hear. You know, we experience spirit and psychic precognitive information in many different ways. Some people can experience it in all of the ways. I'm fortunate in that area. I'm a multisensory medium, which means I can feel them, see them, touch them. I've been touched by spirit. I can smell them. I can hear them. I see them in my mind. That doesn't necessarily make you an exceptional medium. That just means you have more access on how you're going to receive information. You can be an exceptional medium and only hear, and you can be a mediocre medium and have it come to you in multiple different ways. The difference is, as a person who comes multiple ways, it does help if you're teaching, because if you're teaching, you're going to be able to experience it whatever way your student is experiencing it.
Do you find that sometimes it changes? So in one way, and somehow it begins to change.
I think the important part along that, the change, is actually understanding that it's not just the skill of the medium, it's the skill of the spirit communicating. And that is a huge way that it changes. Introverts and extroverts tend to communicate differently. Introverted spirits are more likely to fill us with emotions and to show us images. Extroverted spirits may do those things, but there's more likely going to be a dialogue. They're going to actually be talking to you. And in my case, I can pick up not only what they say, but how they put their words together and their body language when they're delivering that, and that's easier in many ways with extroverted spirits. Introverted spirits will really fill you. They might show you a very clear view of the house they grew up in and that feeling of being in that house. And just like some of us are better communicators than others, some spirits are better communicators than others. What I found is that there's no guidebook for them. They don't get there and somebody's giving them a guidebook on how to communicate with us. So the ones who have practiced anything, like yourself or myself, when we pass, we're going to be better communicators. My dad is an exceptional communicator. He also had a lot of natural psychic ability growing up. He didn't really work with it until he was 60 years old because he had a lot of trauma from being in war. But he spent the last couple of years of his life really learning how to do these things. And when he died, he was such a show off. I mean, people had their windshield wipers coming on. He moved my keys across my kitchen table. Like, I've never had that. That was total show off. And people, like, I joke, my dad is a very charismatic soul. And he was very much a ladies' man. And I have clients, students, who I joke, and I have to tell his best friend, I'm like, my dad still has like this group of ladies who are in his fan club. He's dead. But because he's an easy communicator and he was handsome and charming, they're all like, I just love your dad. I'm like, so we keep our personality. That's the thing to remember too. So if you're like, my grandfather was very different than my dad. When he would come to visit, it was always a smell. I could smell Old Spice cologne filling my bedroom and I could feel him. But my grandfather really wasn't a talker. He really was a person who would sit quietly and watch people, so he would be unlikely to be coming in and, chatting up a storm. So when we're trying to receive information from our beloved dead, we have to remember that how they were in life is really how they're going to be in death. They might be more clear because they've been able to get away from some of their overpowering emotions, but if they struggled with communication, they're not going to be as stellar. I can do like galleries and have one person coming through and it's like the person's in the room having the conversation, and the next person I'm having to go. It's kind of like a sophisticated game of charades, and I'm having to figure out what they mean by these symbols or these images that they're giving to me. But when I
Right.
say that to the parent, to the people, they aren't surprised. They're always like, yeah, he really struggled with communication.
And that's the point, because if they suddenly started presenting themselves in a way that is different
Mm-hmm.
how they were, we would not recognize them.
Exactly.
So they will present themselves in how we remember them. And it's interesting because just a few weeks ago, I was sitting with a group, and a lady came through for one of my fellow students, and she didn't present herself as she was, before she died. She presented herself as she was when she was known by this
Mm-hmm.
person. So she was able to recognize her because of the age that she was, because the age that she was the age that she was when um
Right.
her. And this is the thing, is that there isn't one way in which spirit present themselves. They present themselves in the way that you are best likely or most likely to recognize them, which is the whole point.
Exactly. And they can change their appearance because a lot of times spirits will show up, like you said. And for me, how I experience it is that they might show up how they liked themselves, maybe at 50 and then they died at 90. But for me, it's kind of like a superimposed. I can tell that this is how they want to be seen, but I can also tell that they also got really old and sick. And, I can see that both things are there. And the example I give too is that the things that are our wounds, like my dad had a glass eye because he was in Vietnam, and he will show up with his glass eye, because if he didn't show up with his glass eye, it wouldn't really, that's such a distinguishing thing on a person's face, okay? And but he is not, I have to explain to people, but that doesn't mean he's blind. You lose your leg in life, you're not a spirit that has to deal with what it feels like to have that handicap. Okay, the same thing with mental health though. One of the things that does change is that I often tell my clients that when they have lost somebody to a mental health issue, addiction, which is huge in our culture, in particular, that they almost have to see their dead loved one as two different beings: the person who they loved and that addiction. Because when we die, our emotions get turned way down. So just like we don't have to continue to have that physical ailment that's holding us back, we don't have to have the mental health, schizophrenia, drug addiction, whatever it is, that doesn't have to be on us. And because what you'll find is that while you remember your loved one and they are the person, you feel like sometimes people are like, oh my God, this is like the best of what they were. And I said, no, this is who they are without their mental health problem, because we have a stigma around mental health, whether it's living or dying. We wouldn't think that somebody who died of cancer was going to have to be in that totally, starving body, your body ridden with disease state for the eternity of their soul. And the same thing happens when our loved one has had a mental health problem. That volume of our emotions changing is huge. That release of an addiction is huge. We get to see that person who they truly were without that weight of their mental health problem.
So this is the beauty of this work, is the ability to help people reconnect with loved ones. And when I'm counseling people who are suffering from bereavement, it's almost like I need to give them back their their
Mm-hmm.
their loved one. And
Yes.
it's permission to it's giving people permission to believe that their loved one is there, that what they're sensing is real. And it's not wishful thinking or imagination. It's
Right.
and I can remember one of my clients years ago who had lost his wife very suddenly in a very aggressive, with a very aggressive cancer. And when I started to talk to him about the fact that she may be around him, he lit up. And what subsequently happened is I suggested that if he felt that he could, to put together a photo album and to do things, put her pictures around the house, which he did, at which point he had extraordinary experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them was one night going to bed and suddenly her perfume being absolutely present in the room. Um, my father-in-law, he turns up. We it's the smell of cigarettes. Um,
Yep.
we always know he's around. Nobody is smoking. Um,
Right.
really, it's in a time of crisis. He's there, and it's very very lovely because it's him saying to his son, I'm here, son.
Right.
He doesn't have to say anything.
It's also, it's communicating and venerating our dead and even reaching out to them for guidance or to stand with us in troubled times. That's been part of human history. It's only recently that we've become so sterilized that we think that this is not real. It's like, um, there's so many cultures who the interaction, whether it's the Hispanic culture, or I had Japanese exchange students more than once when my kids were in high school. And I remember one of them that spoke really good English. They would sleep in my healing room when they were there. And so he could read all the books. And came downstairs one morning and he was like, "You're like a Shinto priest." Because the Shinto priests also engage with venerating the dead, and he completely understood it without like any weird superstition around it. He was just like, this is what you do, and he was just a teenager. And one of the things that we've made ourselves really lonely. We've separated as a species and tried to homogenize ourselves down to our nucleus family, which we have found has been failing terribly because we are communal. Human beings need other people. And we also need our dead. It's like, I remember when I was a teenager being really mad at God. And I say God in whatever you want to call God. That's my belief on it. You can call God whatever you want, but I was mad at God. And I got into a car leaving a party and I didn't know that the driver was intoxicated. And I remember being so scared. And instead of praying to God, I prayed to my grandmother who was dead. And I was like, oh my God, like, please, you have to watch over me. And we ended up being fine. And I was not a person who would do that. I mean, I was a member of like, Students Against Drunk Driving, all that kind of stuff. So it really was one of those horrifying moments. Not to say I didn't party, but I was not a person who would endanger myself or others that way. But that was normal, without any hesitation, without, who am I going to ask to help me? I reached out to my grandmother, and I have a story for you about that. So one of my oldest clients, I've had her forever, it seems. I first met her. I used to do house parties, and I'd go to people's houses and I would do psychic readings. They'd put me in a private room, and one by one I'd do readings or I would do spirit communication. And this woman came in and I started reading for her, and I knew that she had a dead daughter. And then I was like, your dead daughter saved your other daughter's life. And the woman was like, oh my God, because her daughter the year before, well, one of her daughters had died at 2 as sudden infant death syndrome. Her other daughter, who had been the younger sister, came after her sister had died. at 16 years old, was in a car accident and didn't have her seatbelt on. But she said that right at the time of the accident, that she felt an arm slam across her and hold her in place. And the mother already knew that. Okay, so me coming in, this stranger to this family, and being like, no, that was your daughter who did that, and those are exceptional cases, but they do happen. That's the thing. There are moments where spirit is able to do something really tremendous. And as a person who works with so many people with that, I get to hear everybody else's really cool stories too.
Very cool, in fact.
Yeah.
Well, Sally, this is a wonderful, I guess, introduction for those who maybe aren't sure about this subject or are new to it. And for those who are very familiar with it, I'm sure that they have thoroughly enjoyed hearing your experiences. And just to remind everyone that the book that we are discussing is called Spirit Speaker, and here it is. And so I will be putting a link to this in the description box. And if people want to get in touch with you, find out more about your work, how do they do that?
My website is salicrow.com. That's SALICROW.com. I'd just like to add that I actually wrote this book for everyday people. Like, this was not really geared, I mean, people who are beginning in mediumship are going to get something out of it. But this book was written to answer all the questions that I get asked all the time by my clients. And so I kept it small on purpose because, my book before that was 500 and something pages. This is just a little over 100. And I did it because I wanted it to be approachable. I wanted everybody, because we all are going to at some point go through the process of death with somebody we love, or, even our own death. And this was really meant to be something that makes it approachable and gives people a little bit of hope and insight.
And that's why I like it so much. It's the simplicity of it. And there's some beautiful poetry in there as well. It's I would say this is a heart book,
It is
and
a hard book.
heart book. And that's why I like it so much. And would recommend that people pick it up and enjoy it. Thank you once again, Sally, for your time today.
Thank you.